Thank you for having me on again. Let's go ahead and get started with slide 4, I believe. Yes, the overview. So today I'm going to first talk about endocrine disruption, and then I'll present some specific information on bisphenol A and phthalates, which are endocrine disruptors widely used in plastic products. And I'll end with some suggestions on how to reduce your exposure to these two chemicals. Slide 5. What is the endocrine system? The endocrine system works through signaling molecules called hormones. For example, estrogens, androgens like testosterone, and thyroid hormones. And it also functions through brain, metabolic, and immune system hormones, as well as many others. Receptors for these hormones are found in every major organ in the body, not just the gonads and the thyroid, but the brain, the heart, the gastrointestinal tract, and kidneys, also the adrenals, and even fat tissue. Slide 6. Tiny amounts of hormones in parts per trillion influence development, growth, sexual maturation, intelligence and behavior, sleep, appetite, thirst, and our response to stressful situations. They also influence things like bone density, blood pressure, blood sugar, cholesterol levels, metabolic level, fat storage, and our ability to fight illness. And those are just some of the things that hormones influence. Slide 7. So what is an endocrine disruptor? According to the Endocrine Society, an endocrine disruptor is an exogenous chemical, meaning a chemical from outside the body, or a mixture of chemicals that can interfere with any aspect of hormone action. The World Health Organization's definition also specifies that a chemical must cause adverse health effects to be considered an endocrine disruptor. Slide 8. Most endocrine disruptors have their origins in the extraction, processing, and/or burning of fossil fuels, including perfluorinated compounds, flame retardants, antimicrobials, plastic solvents, and more. In other words, all of the chemical classes we've heard about in this lecture series contain endocrine disruptors. They are in our homes, schools, and workplaces, food and food packaging, cosmetics, cleaning products, electronics, furniture, building materials, clothing, toys, the list goes on and on and on. Chemicals like toluene and benzene, a known carcinogen that we just heard about in the solvent talk, are the building blocks for a lot of different endocrine disruptors. Just as additives in gasoline, so they're well-known outdoor air pollutants. But what is not well known is that their indoor air concentrations can be 4 to 6 times higher than outdoors due to their presence in household products and building materials. Slide 9. We eat, drink, and touch endocrine disrupting chemicals every day. They're in our food and water, our soil and air, and they're in our bodies. Some remain in our bodies and accumulate over time. Others are metabolized and excreted quickly, but they're so prevalent that at any time they can be measured in nearly everyone tested, and in many different bodily fluids. And concentrations are typically higher in children than in adults. Slide 10. Why should we be concerned about endocrine disrupting chemicals? For one, because it takes a very small amount, a few parts per trillion, to cause harm. And effects have been shown at levels that are lower than human exposure levels. 2, because prenatal and early childhood exposure can lead to permanent changes in how we develop and function. And 3, because exposure can have effects in future generations. Slide 11. So let's talk about bisphenol A, or BPA. BPA was designed in the 1930s as a synthetic estrogen. Since the 1950s, it's been used in commercial products, primarily the production of polycarbonate and epoxy resins. Polycarbonate plastic is basically a string of BPA molecules, and it's pretty much the best when it comes to hardness, clarity, and heat resistance in a plastic product. It's used in baby bottles and water bottles, eyeglass lenses, toys, DVDs, cell phones, and other electronics, appliances, sports safety equipment, airplanes, and there's an awful lot used in making automobiles. Epoxy resins made from BPA are valued because they're highly resistant to corrosion, and they're used in the linings of food and beverage cans, water pipes, dental sealants and fillings, adhesives, and many other products. BPA is also used to make flame retardants, and it's in thermal paper used for cash register receipts. It's also an additive in other widely used consumer products. Slide 12. Production volumes of BPA vary depending on the information source. I've seen reputable reports of global production topping 6 billion pounds per year. In terms of human exposure, data from the U.S. National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, otherwise known as NHANES, has consistently shown BPA to be present in at least 90% of people tested, and this is despite the fact that it passes through our bodies rather quickly. Obviously, our exposure is widespread and continuous. So how does it get in our bodies? One route is through leaching that occurs when the chemical bond that holds the BPA molecules breaks. The rate of leaching is increased by heating, by storing acidic or basic foods and beverages, and by repeated washing of polycarbonate products. Thermal receipts, the kind that you can write on with your fingernail, are another major source of exposure because BPA is not bound to the paper. And people, even adults, have a lot more hand-to-mouth behavior than we like to think. And not only does BPA get into our stomachs through this route, but the latest findings indicate that absorption into the bloodstream directly through the mouth may be an even bigger exposure route than through the digestive tract. BPA can also be inhaled, for example, in household dust. In the environment, BPA degrades within a matter of days in water, and it does not appear to bioaccumulate. Slide 13. There are hundreds of studies showing the effects of BPA in lab animals, but today I'm going to focus on human studies because there are certainly plenty of those for BPA to point to. We recently published a review on the human health effects of BPA. Of the 91 studies we reviewed, over 75 showed a link between exposure to BPA and adverse health effects. Effects that were found in the general population include reduced male sexual function, reduced sperm quality, altered thyroid hormone, blunted immune function, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and obesity. Studies conducted in the general population looking at exposure in the womb showed increased spontaneous abortion as well as effects on childhood obesity, neurodevelopment, behavior, wheeze, and asthma. And some effects in the general population were found to occur at concentrations 5,000 times less than the government's safe exposure level. Slide 14. Given all this, you might wonder what regulations are in place to limit people's exposure. There are some regulations that ban BPA in baby bottles and sippy cups, including the FDA regulation that went into effect in 2012, which, by the way, didn't happen until 11 states and several counties and cities had already enacted bans. And states are continuing to lead the way with regulations on food packaging and thermal receipt paper, too. The most sweeping regulatory effort came in 2010 when Canada declared BPA toxic to human and environmental health. France has banned BPA in food containers, and it's been banned in baby bottles in the European Union and Canada. In response to these bans and to consumer outcry, manufacturers have found ways to create products without BPA. One common substitute is bisphenol S. Unfortunately, it's been shown to be at least as estrogenic as BPA. Its use is already widespread enough that it's being found in the environment, and most concerning is that there's been hardly any research on its health effects. This is called a regrettable substitution and really must be avoided. The green chemistry approach of benign by design is far better. Slide 15. Now we'll talk about phthalates. Phthalates are a group of PVC plasticizers typically used to make products softer and more flexible by allowing the long polyvinyl molecules to slide against one another. They're also commonly used to make fragrances last longer. There are many, many different phthalates, and a lot of them are endocrine disruptors. The one you see on this slide is DEHP, diethylhexylphthalate. Phthalates are used in food packaging, fragrances, personal care products like soap and shampoo, in household products like plastic bags, garden hoses, detergents, shower curtains, and toys. They're also in building materials, paints, and adhesives. They're virtually everywhere. There's so many different phthalates that I've only listed a few estimated production volumes. Oops, I think I moved on to slide 16. Yep. DEHP is listed as 30 million pounds per year, and DINP is 24 million pounds. And with regards to human exposure, some phthalates are detected in nearly every person tested, with relatively high levels found for some phthalates. How do they get in us? Phthalates are not bound to the plastics in which they are mixed, so they're readily released either by leaching or evaporation. As plastics age and break down, the release of phthalates accelerates. Leaching also increases from contact with fatty foods and oily substances. And like BPA, phthalates get into our bodies through many different routes. For example, they're ingested through food products, nutritional supplements and pharmaceuticals, dental sealants and denture material, and the mouthing of children's toys. Skin absorption is also an important route of exposure, for example through the use of men's and women's personal care products, sunscreens, and insecticides. Potential sources of inhalation include breathing of fragrances and hairsprays and baking of modeling clay. Fragrances and hairsprays and baking of modeling clay. A big concern with phthalates is their use in medical devices, such as fluid bags and tubing, particularly in neonatal care units. Phthalates vary to the degree in which they biodegrade in the environment and bioaccumulate in various species, with some being toxic to aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. Slide 17. As with BPA, there are many different studies on the effects of phthalates on lab animals, although I have to say that relatively few of them were performed using doses that are low enough to be relevant to human exposure. So again, I'm going to focus here on the effects found in humans. Prenatal phthalate exposure has been correlated with effects in baby boys such as incomplete testicular descent, increased risk of hypospadias, which is where the opening to the penis is not in the right place, and shorter anogenital distance, which is a marker for androgenic effects. In adult men, increased abdominal obesity and insulin resistance have been shown. Other findings include preterm birth, altered hormone levels, reduced sperm viability, earlier breast development, and asthma. Slide 18. Under the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, the U.S. federal government specifies a maximum allowable percentage of phthalates in toys that can be placed in the mouth. I think it's 0.1%. A few states have similar but slightly different legislation. The European Union has bans for toys and also regulates food packaging and medical devices. But obviously these laws are very limited in the scope of phthalate-containing products that they address. As for alternatives, there are other plasticizers, some with fewer known health effects, but most have relatively little research to prove their safety. There are also alternative plastics that don't require phthalates, but they may have even more health and environmental concerns. And finally, there are plant-based plastics, but even those need to be thoroughly assessed for their effects on human and environmental health. Slide 19. I wanted to say a little bit about labeling. As far as I know, France requires labeling of some food packaging containing phthalates, and the EU is working on labeling medical devices that contain phthalates. But there are currently no laws specifically regulating labeling of BPA or phthalates in the U.S. Some FDA labeling laws apply, but not for chemicals and fragrances, which is where phthalates are commonly found. So it's really hard to know exactly what products contain BPA or phthalates. Products with BPA in them are usually labeled number 7 on the recycling code, and phthalates are usually number 3 with the letter V or PVC below the arrows. Consumers can also look for BPA-free and phthalate-free labeling, but that doesn't mean it isn't made with a regrettable substitute. And this summer, a bill was introduced by Senator Dianne Feinstein requiring labeling of BPA in food packaging. And there have also been efforts in the EU to label medical devices containing phthalates. So there's a little bit of progress there on the regulatory front to keep an eye on. Slide 20. One good thing about these two chemicals is that studies have shown that you can dramatically reduce your levels of BPA and phthalates within a matter of days by changing your behavior. So here are some ideas for how to reduce exposure. First, I would suggest you don't buy plastic products you don't need. I have an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old, and I feel like they survive just fine without bath toys. And of course, don't microwave in plastic. Most people know that. You can look for BPA-free and phthalate-free labels, but keep your eye out for news about substitutes. I think it's better to go plastic-free when you can. And until they can tell us what's in them, I wouldn't buy anything with the word fragrance on it. And that includes laundry products, cleaning products, air fresheners. It seems like everything has to be fragrance these days. And drink out of glass or stainless steel. Avoid canned food and food in plastic packaging, which I know is nearly impossible, but if you have a choice, you can try to make the right one. Use glass storage containers. They're easy to find and not too expensive. And don't take receipts that you don't need. Honestly, if I was a cashier working with thermal receipts, I would wear gloves. And finally, listen to your mother and wash your hands frequently, especially before you eat, but of course not with soap that contains triclosan. Slide 21. The other thing you can do is work on the larger picture. Demand better disclosure and labeling of product ingredients. Demand better laws to protect consumers, and more comprehensive research to prove that a chemical is safe before it's introduced to the market. And demand financial incentives for green chemistry, including from an industry and government. Slide 22. I tried to summarize in a few bullet points here the take-home messages. 1, endocrine disruptors have effects at very low concentrations and are linked to numerous diseases and disorders. Children are particularly susceptible, especially during prenatal development. 2, adverse effects of BPA and phthalates are found in the general population at levels considered safe by the EPA. 3, product labeling should be required at a minimum. 4, alternatives are found when they're demanded by governments or consumers, but we have to avoid regrettable substitutes. And to answer the question, can we do without plasticizers? I would say no, not at this point in time. We've just become too dependent. But we don't need everything to be plastic. The bottom line, the real bottom line, is that if we continue to make so many products out of harmful chemicals, we're going to continue to pollute our bodies. And no child deserves to be brought into the world with the levels of industrial chemicals we're finding in them today. It's our responsibility to figure out how to reduce this exposure as quickly as possible. Slide 23. These are the follow-up questions for the series. You can think about, are BPA or phthalates in the products you manufacture, sell, or use? And what functions do they serve, and how necessary are they? Also, what alternatives have you investigated? If you want to continue this discussion, email Erica at the Green Science Policy Institute. And you can find more information on TEDx's website at endocrinedisruption.org. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. I have a bunch of questions, so we'll get started. I have a question from Kenneth asking, are endocrine disruptor concentrations higher in babies, and if so, why?
One answer is that they have found it in umbilical cords, and it's in so many different fluids. You find it everywhere. So babies are born with hundreds of chemicals in them typically. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if levels in newborns are higher than other segments of the population, but levels in children definitely are, and that's attributed to a couple different factors. One is that they live closer to the ground where you have dust and things settle. They have more hand-to-mouth behavior, and although people are saying that adults have a lot more than we think, but babies are always putting things in their mouths, including objects like plastic toys. And they have immature immune systems, so their bodies aren't prepared to fight things off. And they also have a greater food and water intake per unit of body weight. So all of those things tend to lead to a situation where children have higher levels of contaminants across the board, not just BPA and phthalates, but a lot of other chemicals than adults do. Okay.
I have a question about Tetra Paks. Are they a safe alternative to cans? I think they mean, aren't they paper
sort of
boxes?
Cardboard that are lined?
Yeah.
You know, I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay. Good to know. I have another question. Are there this is from Lynn, are there natural sources of phthalates in the environment?
I don't believe there are natural sources of phthalates. There are certainly natural endocrine disruptors.
Right.
But not phthalates to my knowledge.
Right. I have a question, actually. I had read somewhere that BPA was, I think in the 1930s, investigated as an estrogen replacement drug. Is this true?
It was actually designed to be an estrogen replacement drug, along with DES. It is a synthetic estrogen. That was the goal of making it. And it didn't serve the functions they wanted it to. I think it was for medical purposes. Mm-hmm. And then they found out how useful it was for industrial products, and that's when things really took off in the 50s.
Okay. I have a question about phthalates in IV bags, and I actually had a professor that had worked with Healthcare Without Harm, and I know one of their major products was getting phthalates out of medical equipment. So can you speak to the risks associated with BPA or phthalates in medical equipment?
Yeah, that is a huge concern, and that's one of the prime efforts on the regulatory front is figuring out how to do that, either regulating it or at least labeling it so hospitals can make a choice. And all of the things that so many things that you use in a hospital, the tubing, the fluid bags, the other things that are used, I can't list, I don't know off the top of my head, but they contain fluids that are being pumped into our bodies. And so, and anything lipophilic, anything oily type of substance is going to carry those phthalates right into you. And it's really of a concern, too, in like neonatal care units where you've got infants that are being constantly fed things through these tubes. And as far as I know, there are some hospitals that are changing over, and they have found ways to do it without phthalates.
Okay. I have a question from Lynn about, does your body differentiate between kind of natural endocrine disruptors or kind of exposure to hormones, like, say, I've heard that soy is estrogenic, and how your body reacts to that versus an artificial source?
I think that's the big problem with endocrine disruptors is your body doesn't differentiate. It doesn't differentiate between, the estrogens that you have naturally in your body or, as far as I know, things like the genistein that's in soy or these man-made products. And so they bind to the receptors your body has. All those different organs that I talked about, even body fat, have receptors to receive hormones. And these new chemicals in our environment are latching onto those receptors and blocking them in some instances from our natural hormones, and so it's sending things haywire, and that's the heart of the problem, actually. Okay.
I have a question from Liz about, she asked about the molecular weight of different phthalates and if a higher molecular weight might mean that it is less toxic because she's heard that they have lower endocrine disruption potential.
It does vary by molecular weight. I don't really know the specifics of it. I don't have a strong chemistry background.
Okay.
I think you can find that information online.
Okay.
Yeah.
I actually would also like to ask you, when we talk about endocrine disruptors, we hear a lot about a non-monotonic dose response. Could you maybe speak a little bit to what that means and how that relates to endocrine disruptors?
Sure. I could talk a lot about non-monotonic dose responses.
Great.
I think the best way to explain it is from a regulatory standpoint, actually gives an interesting message that a linear dose response means that as the dose of the chemical increases, the response increases. So you get, a worse health effect at higher doses. Mm-hmm. And because regulatory toxicology was developed on the premise of determining, what levels of exposure to these chemicals are really toxic, especially in terms of worker safety, they're looking at high doses and trying to figure out what's an acceptable dose to be exposed to so that you're not getting the toxic effects. That the system of testing chemicals was designed to start out with high doses, and then they inch it down to the point where they get no effects. Mm-hmm. And then they said, then they usually add a safety factor of, times 10 or times 100, and they go way lower and say this low dose is safe. And they actually never test that low dose. It was just an assumption. And that's the way the safety laws have been made, in this country and all over the world. And that's why all of the furor over endocrine disruptors has come about, is because with endocrine disruptors, because they can have effects at such low doses, they're way down in the ranges where people never really tested before. Mm-hmm. And there's and so that's called the non-monotonic response, where you might see at really low doses an effect on a particular system. And then at moderate doses, there are mechanisms in your body that kick in to ensure that your body's not being fooled by, too much of an endocrine disruptor, too much of a hormone that it doesn't expect. And so you don't see effects in that moderate dose. And then at the higher doses is where you get endocrine effects and toxic effects. And those are the blatant things that we're used to seeing as toxicity. So when you graph that, you see sort of a U or an inverted U as the dose increases, the effects can go up and down and up again. There's all sorts of different shapes of the curve that it can take. And so scientists are, particularly endocrinologists, are trying to bring this to the attention of regulatory agencies, which it now is, and people are trying to figure out how do we design a way of testing chemicals for their safety that doesn't rely on this idea that low levels are safe. And it's very difficult. It's challenging.
Yeah, it's the whole notion of the dose makes the poison is kind of
it's turned on its head.
Yeah, it is. So I've gotten a lot of questions about BPA in cans. I got a question asking what the biggest source of BPA exposure is, and I had read somewhere that was cans, but I'll let you take it from here. And then, how do we know if a can doesn't contain BPA? Should we avoid canned food altogether? Can you speak to that?
Sure. So they line the cans, food cans and beverage cans, with BPA as a way of preventing corrosion of the can when it's storing the food, particularly for acidic foods like tomato products. And I think it's my understanding, don't quote me, but that then they seal it, and in sealing it, they sometimes heat it as part of the process. And so that actually releases some of that BPA into the product, as well as it gets, it leaches in on its own without the heat, but that makes it worse. Some companies have BPA-free cans, and they will say it on the can typically, and you can look for that. It's been really hard to be able to come up with a better solution for things like tomato products. Mm-hmm. And there hasn't been a huge change from you don't see too many BPA-free canned foods. And I don't know if that's because there hasn't been enough consumer pressure or because they really can't come up with anything different. But I think you want to try to avoid that if you can until they can come up with something different. In terms of whether that's the highest exposure, I think that's a pretty big one. But my understanding is that this receipt, the idea that your thermal receipts, that BPA on them is just freely, jumping around in your wallet and your purse and on your hands and getting everywhere, is a huge source of exposure.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we're going to end there. Thank you so much for presenting your talk again, Carol, and for doing another Q&A.